Hello. Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Johnston. For most of my career, I've worked in universities. Now I'm actually at the New Zealand Initiative, and my colleague James Kierstead has recently published a report which I believe will become an historical document on the state of academic freedom in the mid-2020s. It's a compendium of incidents in which academic freedom has been violated. It includes survey results and a fairly, I would say, comprehensive account of where we're at. So today I'd like us to discuss academic freedom and what we need to do to bring it back, because it's not an easy problem. And one of the things that I'd like to just start with is to reflect on Jonathan's opening remarks, in which he read a quotation from 1984 about the sanitisation of language. Because language is, of course, the way in which we refine ideas. And one of the things that universities have done over centuries is to refine both language and methods for testing truth claims. So when we see language under assault and methods under assault, because both of those things are happening, and the universities themselves being complicit in that assault, we know we have a deep problem. Because universities should be the place of all places where ideas are tested. Of course, there are many venues for that in a liberal democracy, including the body politic. But the thing about academic disciplines is that they do represent a refinement of the ability to do that. So the way I'd like to run this session is as a conversation, and we might open with the conversation amongst the panelists, and then we'll move to involving the audience also. So perhaps I'll ask, first of all, Natasha and Grant to give their reflections on the current state of universities in respect of academic freedom, and then we can start to, having diagnosed some of the problems, which I think are fairly well rehearsed already, then we can move to what we ought to do about it, which is a very difficult problem. Would you like to go first, Natasha? Yeah.
Okay, I think the state that we're currently in is obviously not great in terms of academic freedom, although I think it is always good to be mindful that we are not North Korea, and that here we are, people in the room who have spoken out, and they haven't been taken off to the gulag, and that's great, and I'm deeply appreciative of that. The list of incidents that are in the report written by James Kierstead, and you're the co-author as well, aren't you? Or is it just James?
James is the author.
Right.
I and a couple of other people, Max Salmon and Stephanie Martin, helped with it.
Right. Well, those incidents are sort of often grab the headlines in the sense that here's a case of cancellation or deplatforming. You know, an event was cancelled because the Chinese embassy had a word in quiet, or you know, somebody came to talk and was banned from campus. These things attract attention. They're really important because, as was noted in the first session, it isn't just the person who is overtly in the gun, it is everyone else who's watching and learning from that. Oh, I'd better not be the one who sticks my head up. But I actually wanted to talk about two other things which I think we've paid less attention to, and one of them is around university policies that in a far more insidious way circumscribe the areas of permissible conversation, teaching and research, to the point that they undermine the purpose of the university as a truth-seeking institution. I mean, if universities exist in order to discover and disseminate knowledge, that implies that there needs to be systems for seeking the truth and testing the truth, because not everyone's bright idea is true. And university policies in a variety of ways, and I'm happy to go into details, but through things like centralised curriculum mandates, where certain things are put on the curriculum and other things are taken off, and this can then extend to who gets hired in order to teach particular areas of curriculum. And we've seen that in the University of Auckland with our centralised curriculum framework transformation project, which has mandated, sometimes in quite mild language, but for instance, a compulsory course on Mataranga Māori and the Treaty of Waitangi, which will have centrally determined content that will go out to every faculty, and then they will embroider it themselves, but they will do so using sort of hand-picked committees of like-minded people, at least as far as we can tell. It is certainly not a pluralistic, robust discussion of alternative perspectives.
So there are two problems there. One is the compulsory nature of it, and the other is that we suspect fairly strongly that it won't be presented in a way that is for debate, but more as an indoctrination.
Well, with centralised content, it can't be. I mean, you can have, look, everyone has to learn something about New Zealand. Fine. Let's have 10 courses across the university and academics will teach them from whatever perspective they want. I wouldn't actually have a problem with that. And that's actually, funnily enough, I used to teach in Singapore, and that's exactly what they did. They said there's got to be, everyone in Singapore, in this university, has to know something about Singapore studies. I taught one of those courses. It was like any other course. The teaching team decided on the content. Yeah. That's not what's happening at Auckland.
Yeah. What other sorts of policies do you see from the top which are constraining academics to exercise their duty, I would say, to publicly discuss ideas?
I think there are policies around research, research funding. Certain kinds of money comes only if you can include a particular perspective, such as have a vision mataranga or serve a particular political aim. There is our research ethics process, which I do believe it's important to have ethical research, ethical standards in research, but we have an overt requirement to advance the Treaty of Waitangi in our ethics process.
In every research study, no matter how distant from anything.
If you're doing research on human subjects, until the end of this year, I'm stepping down, but I run a research centre, and when all research centres were required to reapply for their existence to continue, there was one of the questions was, what are you going to do to uphold the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi?
And you have to satisfy them. I agree with this. For many years, the ethics process, so-called ethics process, has been getting more and more onerous, and it's been getting more and more difficult to be able to conduct research, and there are long delays while the ethics committees work through the applications, and then they come back and they want you to do a whole lot of things. Certainly these treaty provisions are extremely difficult to address a lot of the time.
I mean, but it's not just, the ethics is not just used to manage that particular area of research. There's also, if you actually wanted to, for instance, talk to employees without the employer agreeing, which has implications for other kinds of research you could do, it would be very difficult. And a lot of it is just institutionalised risk aversion. Please let us not have any complaints from anybody.
That's right, let alone any threat of litigation or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are the threats from your perspective, Grant?
Yeah, I mean, I'd take a bit of a bigger perspective on the sector in general. I think there's more systemic problems. I don't use a business analogy. People have heard about Kodak. Remember Kodak doesn't exist anymore? They used to do films and stuff. They invented the digital camera. This is one of these cautionary tales of the 1990s, really. They invented the digital camera. They saw its potential, but their infrastructure was so unwieldy that they couldn't develop that. Not only couldn't they develop it, they doubled down on their film processing as that was the future, and they eventually went out of business. So people would say in business, don't be Kodaked. And I feel at the moment that the tertiary sector around the world, actually, but New Zealand's no different. In fact, we may be at the front of that. The question is how fit for purpose we are for running in the world, and there's many levels of this, right? So one is, of course, you can learn everything that we teach on YouTube from people that are better than us often, with more ideas than us often. So that's changed. You can do that cheaply.
Although one thing you can't do on YouTube is have a conversation.
No, that's right. So we'll get to that. So it was last week that a sociology professor from the University of Canterbury also commented that he felt that part of the problem at the University of Canterbury, and I can assure him it's not just the University of Canterbury, I have no idea about the University of Auckland, but certainly in AET, that half of his students were functionally illiterate. And so there's massive, is that true in Auckland?
Maybe 30%.
Okay, so you're doing better than us.
It's true across the board because there isn't really any stringent literacy requirement in the UE award.
Yeah. So therefore you're in a university setting now where, basic reading and writing and mathematics, I teach in scientific and health subjects, isn't there. So to engage in conversations at a level with these guys is very difficult. And then you think, well, postgraduate will be much better, but then because of the international component, that's half of those students. No, I'm not decrying. There are some fabulous young people that have been an enormous privilege for me to be part of their lives and be part of that, and it's been a massive thing. But there's systemic problems in this sector because of that. You layer on top of that, I guess I feel I've had a good run with academic freedom, frankly, up until a period of time. My job is public health. I've been interested in nutrition. In my opinion, the food pyramid that the USDA put out in 1976 was one of the biggest medical scams in history. Doing the exact opposite actually turns out to be a good idea, in my opinion. And I had a good crack at that through the 2010s to the 2019, I suppose. And not only that, there was voracious engagement with that, and some professors, particularly from the University of Auckland and Otago, wrote letters and called the Vice Chancellor, asked me to be sacked. But to be fair, my university said, no, there's laws about this, and you guys, he could be right, he could be wrong, but he's within his lane and carry on. So I enjoyed that. That's been a good thing.
Yeah.
And 30 of his colleagues signed it, and then 200 plus wrote a counter letter saying that he was racist.
Well, Doug Aliff's here. He could talk to that, actually.
Doug and Elizabeth and Kendall, they're all part of that. Yeah. Perhaps have the microphone. Yeah.
I'll get you to start again. We had a few people who were keen to hear at the back.
Okay, sorry. So Robert Nola belonged to the Rationalist Society, of which I'm a member, and he thought that the Rationalist Society would support him in thinking that the teaching of Maori myths and stuff should not be part of the science department. Very happy to be in other departments, maybe sociology or something like that, or religious department, but not taught as a science, because it clearly isn't a science. And so he was not supported in that, and lots of... so I also know someone else who worked at the university and got constructively dismissed at your Auckland University and won a case against them and got money out of them, because a lot of the lecturers, I'm sure if you worked for Auckland University, you would have had this thing come round for you to sign to say that Robert Nola was a racist and all the rest of it. And there was put pressure on all these lecturers to sign this thing. And if they didn't sign it, they ended up in the HR department, which is what this guy did. He ended up in the HR department, because he wouldn't sign this letter. So when you think that 200 lecturers signed it, most of them are under duress. So what I'm thinking is that the universities are very much captured by this ideology. So that's the problem.
Yeah, I think you make a really important point. And another point that's been made that was related to that, Nigel was talking about, which is the kind of culture of, what I would say is the culture of cowardice amongst the academics, which is keep your head down and protect yourself. And that is... I call it cowardice. It's actually a dereliction of duty for academics to do that. In many professions, in many walks of life, it's not actually a duty to speak your mind. But for academics, it is. To be the critic and conscience of society is part of the role.
I 100% agree with that. I wanted to say that in that previous talk. They think about bravery and courage as not some sort of macho expression of that. It's just carrying on when you're scared anyway. And that is the job of an academic. Part of the problem, which I was trying to get to in my long-winded way before, is the demise of the capability of our institutions and our students and our inability to change is also reflected in, unfortunately, in the capability of our staff. And so I don't see many of the academics that I work with as being up to being the critic and conscious of societies, frankly. And therefore, the ones who are brought down by exactly what you're saying, which is a weight of numbers against that.
That's right. And every time, as you say, something like that happens, it sends a signal to everybody to shut your mouth. Yeah.
But I think the other thing that it points to is an urge to shut it down, to quote the quote that was made earlier, rather than to say, let me explain to you why you got it wrong. And this is I think the most pernicious idea is that it is somehow harmful to engage in that discussion. I mean, if you disagree with me on what is a man or what is a woman, we should be able to talk about it. But what has happened, and it's happening on campuses but other places as well, is that process of talking about it, airing of different points of view, engaging with why the Holocaust happened, or why intelligent design is wrong, or why humans can't change sex. That process of talking about it has been explicitly labelled as something that is harmful to our students or our fellow staff, and therefore cannot take place. And that, I think, is one of the most pernicious things that prevents the university from meeting its mandate. Because if you can't talk about it and if you can't explain whatever your perspective is, you are not going to advance towards the truth. But I understand there are a few people with mics
Let's go
up.
to the back there, please.
To what degree are the three of you satisfied with the way that free speech is taught in the institutions?
Well, it isn't taught.
Yeah, that's 100% right. It's not
if it
taught.
is, it's by accident or because somebody decided to do it. I mean, I actually, before COVID, with James Kierstead, we were both at the time at Victoria, had planned to start a first-year course in which we were going to teach, amongst other things, the way in which to have an academic discussion. By doing just that with one another and then involving students. As it turned out, we didn't get to do it because the university closed because of COVID, but then it did come back in another guise. And the last thing I did when I was at Victoria was to convene a course for students who had not got UE and wanted to come to university, and it was a preparation course. And we did this exercise within that. And it's actually one of the most heartening things that has happened over the last few years, because we opened this idea with some trepidation. So the way it operates is that you have the students sit in a circle, and you have a continuum on the ground where they can place a token to signal their agreement or disagreement and the degree thereof with a topic under discussion. And when we first did this exercise, we chose fairly, well, not innocuous, but uncontroversial or topics that were not likely to push buttons. Things like, we can never know anything for sure, or it's always wrong to use violence, these kinds of things. Now, what happened was that they engaged enthusiastically, and at the end of it, they said, can we please do that again, but with more controversial topics? And so we did, and that also went very well. Yeah. Over here, please.
Hi, this is sort of more related to the previous topic you were discussing, but you're talking about many of the staff feel pressured to follow the herd or to keep quiet. Is it possible to have any sort of stab at the numbers in a general sense? Because as someone on the periphery of academia, it seems that many of the staff are actually insane. Do you have any idea of who actually really believe this stuff? And the censorship is part of it, a part of a general way of looking at the world. But do you have any idea of how many actually believe all this stuff as opposed to those who are just having to keep their heads down?
I actually think that we have relatively few totalitarians on campus, and I'm not going to venture an opinion on whether they're sane or not sane, but I think you have a large majority that just wants to get on with their job and teach whatever it is they teach, and don't want to become a target. But I will point to the University of Auckland has a Senate, which is a body that is open to all professors plus sort of various deanlets and stooges. But the University of Auckland Senate has now twice in the last 18 months made very clear and overwhelmingly supported statements that reflect a commitment to free speech, including speech that might allegedly be harmful in some people's eyes. But as long as it's lawful and as long as it's civil, you should be able to say it. And so my Senate colleagues have voted overwhelmingly in favour of a very robust freedom of expression, academic freedom policy by about 75 to 80%. We still don't have that policy because we've been blocked, and I'm happy to share some of the details as to how and why. But as in terms of the reflection of what my colleagues' instincts are, I would say at least at the professoriate in the Senate, I think most people are actually quite sane and quite in favour of academic freedom.
My experience is that I'll be sitting in individual offices with senior professors, junior staff, whatever, and they feel very free to, and we have free and frank exchanges of information, and they'll say very clearly to me, I would never say this outside this office. That's every day. That was yesterday and the day before.
So alongside kind of ideological imposition from the top down, we have this culture of cowardice, and that to me is the real killer. Because if academics were prepared to stand up in much greater numbers, we would have far less of a problem, because those who are trying to impose that ideology would have serious challenge. And I'd like to actually just reflect on, I think it was a comment either Nigel or Jonathan made in the last session, which is that the more people see others standing up, the more they will be inclined to do it themselves. And I'm a psychologist, and there was an experiment run in the 1950s by a psychologist called Solomon Asch, in which he...
the line link.
Yeah. So what he did was he had these lineups of people, all but one of whom were his Confederates, unbeknownst to the real participant in the experiment. And he would say, today we're going to do an experiment in visual perception, and I'm going to show you cards with lines on them, and you need to tell me whether they're the same in length or different. And then he would show cards that had lines of blatantly different lengths, and all the Confederates would say, they're the same, they're the same, they're the same. And then some 50 or 60% of the time, the real participant would fall in line and say that they were the same. But if there was one dissenter amongst the Confederates, the rate at which the true participant conformed fell through the floor, right? And so that's a real lesson to us, that if we are prepared to be the one who stands up and perhaps pay a cost, right, because it's not risk-free to be the first one to stand up, but you may well make a huge contribution. And I would like actually to acknowledge the 7 heroes of the listener letter here, because they stood up and they paid a cost, but the result has been a galvanisation of the academic, or elements of the academic community behind the problem that we have with academic freedom and pushing back against that. So all kudos to them.
I mean, sometimes on that, like, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I mean, it's just,
then we'll have Professor Schatzfeger. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay.
You go first, and I'll ask my question after.
That's fine.
No, I was just
We've
going to
got
agree
time.
that. I mean, the propensity of everyone to agree. I mean, you only have to look at COVID, what happened over there, to see that in real action in society. And as a youngster, when you wondered how Nazi Germany happened, then now you know. The thing is, I sat there just before the mandates happened, and I knew a couple of teachers and a few midwives losing their jobs, and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I should just write an essay. I'm in public health. Someone should say something that this seems a bit wrong. So I wrote an essay, mainly for my own, to be cathartic for myself. And all of a sudden, it's been, I was a bit like, this could go quite badly. The university might be upset. And within 2 weeks had been viewed 2 million times. It's like, so you know, this. I didn't want to write that essay. I was scared to write that essay. I thought everyone would get angry about it, but it was just a good idea. It's a good thing. I'm glad I did. So, you know, like, I don't know why there's not more of that. I didn't feel particularly brave. I just did it.
Yeah. Well, on the issue of courage, you know, sometimes people will say, "Oh, you're terribly brave for speaking your mind," and my response is, "No, I'm not. The people who are brave were the ones who stormed the beaches of Normandy in 1944. That was brave, right? We risk being called some nasty names.
They were probably shit scared as well.
I keep thinking about when I was at university and, you know, the relative youth that you have to deal with all the time, like, and that keeps coming back to me whether or not it's mostly from the top down or from the bottom up. Is the free speech issue affecting you guys as academics? Because there's that saying of, oh yeah, if you're not liberal when you're young, you have no heart, and if you're not conservative when you're old, you have no brain.
Yeah.
And if they're like, is this an age thing? And maybe the youth of the students is having some sort of effect and pressure?
The students aren't the problem, because as you say, students have always pushed against, you know, what they see as...
But they pushed against the establishment.
That's right.
In the
and
past.
the problem is that the establishment is refusing to push back, because that's the role of the establishment, right? The youth should be pushing against the establishment, but the establishment shouldn't just be caving into their every demand, because that isn't doing the establishment's job. I mean, ultimately, you don't want ossification. You don't want the establishment to get all of its own way forever, because then you get, you know, just...
So maybe they are doing the right thing. The students are doing the right thing. They're pushing hard
they're doing their
on the
part,
things they're passionate about.
But the job of academics is to educate them, and that means pushing back against their stupid ideas, so that their ideas improve, right? That's what my professors did for me, and, you know, hopefully it had some effect. Professor Schwertwig has been, yeah.
I just came back from Sorbonne University, spent a month there, and when I tell them what's going on in New Zealand, they just look at me and they can't believe it, because they say, well, you're kidding me. Why on earth would you push, say, mythology into the core sciences? But nevertheless, what I like to say is that academic freedom is indeed under threat in New Zealand. As you know, I come from Germany, and academic freedom was under threat in the Third Reich, and that came from the far right. And now I can see exactly the same, but coming from what you might call the progressive left. And I see three layers where academic freedom is under threat. Number one is teaching, and you already said that, because there is, for example, at Mass University, a new curriculum framework coming through, and where we are getting told what to teach by people who never ever taught that subject. There are no experts in that subject, and they will tell us what we have to teach. And the second is research. I mean, as an academic, you should be able to do the research you like to do, freedom of research. But no, we have to tailor our research for, you know, in order to get money into the system, because I have been told many times, you didn't get a Marston grant, so maybe we have to reconsider your position here. And but to get grants through doing fundamental science in New Zealand becomes more and more difficult. And the third one where I would say is academic freedom is under threat, it is because we as academics should be the critique and conscience of our society. We already talked about that. But it is almost impossible nowadays at universities to, for example, criticize the management. And if you do, you face, say, a serious misconduct case, and if you go to court, it costs you, excuse my word, a shitload of money, right? And some academics told me they spent $80,000 or even more to take the university to court. At the end, they won the case, but lost the job anyway. So there is no protection at the moment of academic jobs, and there is no way. Say, let me just tell you what would happen in Germany. You can take the university to court, because in Germany people are protected. They have an insurance which would pay for all the legal fees. So I do not know, we don't have that in New Zealand, and somehow the university has loads of money to take any academic to court. But of course, there is this kind of imbalance at the moment which we have.
So I think that's a point really worth picking up on, and I'd like to hear from the other panellists and also from other members of the audience on what we do about the situation that we have. Because if you look at the law, it's already pretty clear about what academic freedom is. If you look at the relevant section of the Education Training Act, it's the ability of academics and students to advance and discuss ideas within the law on pretty much any matter that they choose. In fact, you know, being within the law is the only restriction that the Act places on it. And yet we have this problem. So I'm not personally convinced that further legislation is going to do any good, because we've got the legislation. The question is, how on earth do we make the universities obey it? And what are the views?
Yeah, I've been critical of a new law needed. I don't think we need them. The framework exists. It's interesting with that about criticising your employers, because I wrote an essay roundly criticising my employers, got 1 million views, and I didn't hear anything from them at all. I was hoping to attract their attention.
I think it's pretty hit and miss. I think that the culture of open inquiry at the university and its primary mandate as a truth-seeking institution, which requires that all voices be heard and debated and subjected to the same scrutiny. I think we can all think of some pretty high-profile, you know, assaults on that are currently coming from what we might identify as the political left or self-described people with progressive ideas. But I don't actually think that is the core problem. The core problem is the fact that for a couple of decades now, we're having universities increasingly run by administrators who are really not invested in that core mandate of the university. And so a combination of risk aversion, desire to cut costs, maintain reputation, keep your university in the rankings. You know, today certain ideas are perceived to have institutional establishment weight behind them. Tomorrow it can be a different set. And you know, I have had colleagues who've had overt pressure placed on them for doing work on labour abuses, where the university ethics process was weaponized by outsiders with deep pockets and political connections to attack research done at the University of Auckland. So the assaults and attacks on academic freedom come from any political perspective. It is not just a problem of the political left. But I think what we do about it, yeah, I mean, the Act is actually vague on a few points, because a lot of the freedoms are actually given to the university and its staff, and the university in its corporate form has become big part of the problem. I think the Act was written to defend institutional autonomy, and it didn't really, the people who wrote that section didn't really envisage a scenario where the staff would have to be protected from the university executive and its managers. So I would tweak that.
So the solution, of course, is to do an Elon Musk on the university. So you go into the management, you sack 80% of them because they don't actually do anything, and the place would work better. No, seriously, it's a thing. So if you look at where the growth has been in university salaries and bureaucracy, it's all there, and it's never cut. I mean, when I look at the teams at the coalface who actually do the teaching, the research, we're small groups of people in the university, and there's this massive thing. Just sack the whole lot, and we'll carry on.
The Auckland VC gets paid $600,000 a year, I believe that's correct.
I thought it was 750, I think.
Sorry.
Hi there.
Hi. I think you're right. Yeah.
It's on. It is. My question is to Professor Grant Schofield, and it's somewhat dependent if you understand the context of it. So, obviously, given your public health background, are you familiar with the Health at Every Size framework that's come about? Yeah. I wanted to perhaps dive into as a particular example of an idea that has inserted itself into a field that that in medicine that particularly likes to what's the word, frame itself as evidence-based treatment of of patients. I wondered if you haven't had any thoughts on how we counter things like health at every size that have unfortunately very lacking evidence base to it, but also you have academics within University of Auckland currently who are arguing strongly for it. Yeah, that's the point for it.
Oh, so this health at every size is sort of going, well, people come in different sizes and there's other health behaviours, which is true. So there's, if you're fit, but you're also quite fat, that's better than being quite fat but not very fit. So those are all things. So, there's truth there as well, but, obviously the size of the species is profoundly different. If you look at my classroom photo of Standard 1 in Twizel Primary School in 1974, those kids look like they're not fed properly by modern standards.
I guess the issue, though, is can we discuss that openly?
Yeah, no. And so that's not discussed. I think it gets much more perverse than that, actually. In public health, my field's paralysed by it. So I'll give you a specific example. I was just giving a talk at the General Practice Conference in Rotorua, go there annually, and just after me was Pharmac talking, and they were talking about allopurinol, gout medicines, and how much they're investing in those, specifically for Maori. And so, because I was there, I asked a question. I was like, well, why don't we concentrate on dietary interventions here as well, because they're going to be cheaper and they're going to be more effective, and allopurinol is quite has some insidious side effects as well. And they said, oh no, that would be racist. I was like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, Maoris suffer gout more than anyone else, so pushing nutrition interventions on them would be racist. And so you're paralysed by a lack of action because of even more bizarre things than you think. I mean, in modern public health, you would never start tobacco cessation programs because, of course, the rich white people would be the first people to stop smoking, except for Doug Elliff, who still smokes. You should stop. And that would create more health inequalities. So in modern days, we would not do anything about smoking, lest we affect people wrongly. So we're paralysed by that currently.
Kendall.
I'd like to riff off what Natasha said in terms of the way universities are led now. 20 years ago when you had vice-chancellors and deans and so on, after their term they would go back to being an apparent department. And so if they behaved badly, they would sort of fairly obviously suffer the consequences, but they also had a sense of community with their fellow academics. That's gone now, and that's kind of what Natasha was getting at too. But there's something else going on as well that hasn't been discussed so far today, and that's these self-selected representatives of particular identity groups, equity particularly, and within our university, it's Māori as well. Now, they claim to speak for shall we say, marginalised groups, but most of the time they don't. They're advancing various agendas that operate at various levels.
One would have to believe that the marginalised groups were homogeneous if somebody was to speak for them as a whole.
Exactly. So that's I mean, you can get into Spivak's strategic essentialism idea, where in order to make political change, you kind of have to make races or particular disadvantaged groups essentialist. But more fundamentally, at a political level or at an institutional level, the way things operate is that these people get into school executives, faculty executives, and university executives, and they basically dominate proceedings partly through a sense of sort of moral authority.
Or assumed moral authority.
Assumed moral authority.
You're absolutely right. Actually, if anyone's really interested in an object lesson in this, it's worth getting hold of the emails that the Free Speech Union got out of Victoria University during the furore over at the free speech event that Nick Smith, the Vice-Chancellor, organised there. For those of you who may not know, he convened a panel that I was going to sit on, and Jonathan Ayling and a couple of others. But then there were huge complaints that was... Well, first of all, Jonathan and I were absolutely racists and all kinds of other things, right-wing, etc. And then every identity group in the university weighed in and insisted that it have its representative on the panel. And when the thing finally convened, there were 2 panels, and Jonathan and I were still there by the skin of our teeth, but everybody, just about everybody else, was pushing interestingly, more or less the same line, but on behalf of their particular identity group. So by purportedly increasing the diversity of the panel, that actually reduced its viewpoint diversity considerably.
And that was also the case as to why, when we tried to have our first attempt to get an academic freedom of expression policy in front of the Auckland University Senate, it was blocked for several months by an assembled coalition of identity group representatives who were then able to say that the working group that had produced the statement in favour of free speech was illegitimate because it didn't have enough identity group people on it. And part of the reason, or they were there, but partly they had absented themselves in a few cases. And so you have a situation where a few, and I do not think they are at all representative, because that would sort of be impossible to speak in front of everyone just because you share some ancestral DNA, that you can be influential in the room, but you can also be influential by withholding your consent to be in the room. You know, this meeting is illegitimate because I wasn't there by choice.
I just want to say that what you said perfectly describes my whole world at the university and is the thing that most makes me not want to go to work and give up.
So what do we do about it?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about giving up for that exact reason. But I might be more motivated.
Come and work at the New Zealand Initiative, that's what I do. Doug, go ahead.
Yeah. So my name's Doug Iliffe. I wonder, because I was one of the listener letter authors, I'd just like to sort of revisit a little bit. Thank you. Thank you very much. So a certain amount of myth has built up, and one of the things I'd like to do is just to reprise very briefly what it is that Kendall, who's here, Elizabeth, who I'm sure is in the room somewhere, both Rob Noller and Mike Corblis have since died. Garth's not here, and we haven't had any contact with John Werry for some time. What we were really complaining about was a thing that was going to be inserted into the NCEA curriculum, which was to be teaching Maori students that science was not for them because it was an instrument of the coloniser. The whole business about whether Mātauranga Māori might be included, might in some way inform the science system and so forth. This is really something that came up later. What we were saying is, hang on, we don't want you telling Maori kids that science is not for them. That's really all we did. Okay, so this was, so seeing this as a racist attack on Mātauranga Māori is, I think, quite a difficult thing to do. I wanted to comment on 2 kinds of reaction that there were, one of which was as you mentioned just now, the letter put forward by Sean Hendy and Susie Wiles and sent around to lots of people to sign. I have to say first, I know of no consequences for anybody who didn't sign it. So I don't know that this constituted compelled speech. You may have one particular example, but I think that would be rare. What I will say is that of my 50-odd psychology colleagues, 6 of them signed it. So it's really not very many. So most people were not sort of buying into this argument. Going through, because of course, as you would do, feeling a little bit paranoid, kind of look through the list of names and see who would be there and things. There are really rather few from the science faculty that Kendall and I are both part of. Not none, and not not a number that you wouldn't worry about, but there were far, far more who didn't sign it than who did sign it. And I, at least, and I think I can probably speak for the others too, have been approached regularly by people afterwards, just as you described, first thanking us, saying, it's really good that you did that, you were brave, yeah. I mean, I think it was Keith Miller who said, the Australian cricketer, who said, that's not danger, danger is having a Messerschmitt up your ass. And so many people approach us wanting to talk privately. Many people didn't sign the letter, but they were part of the kind of mild majority, and what would have been nice would be to, have a letter that was in the other direction, replying to people like Wiles, Hendy and so forth.
I really take your point that, the vast majority were not involved in that, but 2,500 did sign it, and to me, the worry is that it just sends the message loud and clear that if you say something the kind of established ideology doesn't like, then we're coming for you.
Yeah, but there's also consequences.
Which is why your point that actually lots of people will support you is a really important one.
That's where I wanted to come to. But I'll just hear what Grant had to say.
I was going to say there's also consequences for you, Doug. Career-wise and financially potentially as well.
Yeah. The one thing to say is I don't think we were particularly brave, and I think it's partly because we didn't anticipate what the consequences might necessarily turn out to be. Nevertheless, there were consequences that were fairly severe for several of us, and so some of these people who approach us say, seeing what happened to you has made us less likely to speak up. So this is where the people who do need not just this kind of passive good on you, I think we need active support no matter what the issue might be. And that's really what I want to say about that.
Thank you. Nathan? After here. Next.
Thank you, Peter Fuller, barrister. To the extent that students are supposed to push back against the establishment, I suppose the problem with that in the current model is if students are actually customers and the business, the customer's always right. And I suppose that's one of the dilemmas. So whether the model can sort of cater for fee-paying students and also fail students, for example, challenge students. But I suppose a more... Is really the issue that it is actually an assumption that universities are truth-seeking, because it seems to me that within the institutions themselves, that is not necessarily a given, and you've got basically the postmodernists' question of the whole narrative of an ultimate sort of truth agenda or even purpose, and don't we need to win that argument first to get universities back on track, because a lot of people perceive that the role is to produce social justice agendas and other things. So it does seem that the core purpose does need to be better argued.
Yep. I think you've put your finger on two really, actually what I think is the pincer movement that's caused the problem. One is the commercialisation of universities, and the other is the scourge of postmodernism got way out of hand. And on the first, I think my reflection is that far too many young people go to university, so that's one thing. And so actually maybe if the university, I mean the funding model is something that really needs attention. It'll be interesting to see what the Peter Gluckman's committee has to say on that quite soon now.
When is it coming out?
I think there's some interim report this month sometime. I could have that wrong, but I think that's right. But I can imagine a model of the university that was commercial, where this university said, we're going to have high standards, so you might fail, and you're not getting your money back if you do. And you come here and you expect to have, tough ideas put in front of you, and you're going to learn to discuss those ideas with evidence. And we're going to put you under the blowtorch. So if you're up for that, pay the money and come in. If you get a degree from us, that's going to mean something, right? As opposed to what we have now, which, as you say, is very dubious in relation to whether it's a truth-seeking organisation at all, and where you can't fail anybody, more or less, who is breathing and hands in most of the assignments.
Well, no, they don't have to do all of that.
Right. So what is that degree worth? And maybe employers are kind of figuring out not much a lot of the time. Do you have any?
Let's take some more questions.
Yeah.
So definitely way too many people go to university as a percentage. It used to be something like 15%. In the UK, it's 45%. So obviously intelligence and academic ability is on a bell curve. So now obviously standards have got to get lower because no one fails. So that's a problem. There's a problem with identity politics. So the guy I was talking about, for instance, his KPI statistics went down based on the ethnic groups that the university wants to track, and he was called into HR for that reason because he did a colour-blind marking of exams, and he was told, no, you're failing all these Maori and Pacific Island students. He said that there's a problem there because they shouldn't even been at university in the first place. One of them can't, their English skills are terrible, their math skills are terrible. Why are they even at the university? He taught in England for 10 years, he taught in South America for a couple of years, and he said it's a completely different situation here because you've got all this ethnic mix going on. So that's a real problem. And if you turn it on its head, and you said, well, it's not Maori, or say, like, for instance, you were talking about, you've got to say this group or that group or that group, and no, they have to be represented in committee or this, that, the other. But if you ever say a very large group, which is always underrepresented in all this stuff, if you said, well, not Maori, let's make it Chinese. Where are the Chinese representatives or the Korean representatives or any of the Asian ones? They don't exist in New Zealand. Like, they never, even though they're like 35% of Auckland, but they never, ever. What about their representatives? They're not pushing for it. No, you've got to have Maori on this, but not them. And I find that so racist.
I don't think that the solution to sort of tokenistic identity group representation is to have more identity groups added. I think the issue is there is a pervasive institutional unwillingness to see us fail our students or to make them too unhappy in terms of making them work hard. I actually think that perhaps unlike some elite universities like Harvard, we don't actually have a whole lot of so-called snowflakes among our student body. This maybe is because I teach in the business school, but my sense is that students want to get the piece of paper and want to get out of there. They're actually mostly quite apathetic. They're not the ones trying to cancel their lecturers in the main. Now, there are some exceptions, and we all know about them. But the problem is that the more systemic problem is how the university responds to what is, I think, is a actually very small, tiny minority of students who are so intolerant that they want to get their lecturer cancelled for something he or she said in class.
Don't you think it's because they're kind of abetted by some of the staff as well?
I think that's very possible, that there are certain pockets of the university where, yes, and postmodernism probably has something to do with it as well, where it is, the idea of a truth-seeking mission is overtly scorned. And what has happened across academia, in terms of how do we fix it, I think one of the problems is that as a group, as a profession, we've been allowed to retreat into our echo chambers, where if you want to do, rigorous research in a certain area, you will have colleagues and you will be held to high standards and you will hold them to high standards. But you will not look in your department and see the absolute lousy research and lousy PhD training and terrible training happening, and you will shut up about it because they will live in their echo chamber or their ghetto, and they will have their own journals, and therefore they will perform. So this retreat from mutual engagement in the discipline, and I understand free speech does not actually compel anyone to listen to me, but I think one of the unique things about the university is that you should, in fact, within your discipline, within your department, you should be compelled to actually engage. Rather than just say, well, you go do that lousy stuff, I don't care about it, as long as I'm left alone to do the stuff I care about.
Again, it's a duty, to hold one another to higher standards, because that's the only way that we approach truth better. Yeah.
Well, you're sort of assuming that people actually come to work and do stuff. Like, you know, I don't know about what University of Auckland's like. You walk around AUT on a Thursday afternoon, and I don't know.
It's pretty deserted on campuses these days. Over here.
Oh yeah. Hi. So one of the things that, I mean, I think it's a great work that the Free Speech Union does in terms of tackling like direct attacks on free speech that come from the faculty and stuff. But I think a lot of that can be a bit reactive, mainly, and I guess that's the nature of of being a free speech union. You're mainly reacting towards attacks. But I think another problem that I see is that I think especially in some faculties, like for example history, like what Nigel Biggar was talking about earlier, is that you tend to get a predominance of people with a certain perspective, for example, who'd want to argue that there's no two sides sort of, I mean, there's nothing good came out of colonialism, for example, and that results in a bit of a monoculture. So it's not really that they are attacking free speech, but if most of your professors are only teaching about the bad things that happen, most of the students that are coming out of that system are only, that's all they know. So maybe this isn't, I'm not sure, do you guys have any ideas on how that gets tackled? Yeah.
I would say the problem definitely begins at school, because kids come out of school really not knowing anything. And in part that's because for now nearly 20 years we've had a curriculum that doesn't specify any knowledge. And so, well, I mean, it's true. I mean, a little bit, but... and so teachers are left to their devices largely to teach what they want. Now, that's not so true in mathematics and science at secondary school. There's still content there because the NCEA system is going to assess certain knowledge, and so that gets taught. But again, it's not... The assessment system isn't designed in a way to make sure that students really learn it deeply. And so I do think that we have a knowledge problem. And without knowledge, like historical knowledge, for example, what are you going to believe about colonialism when all these professors tell you that it was unmitigated genocide? You have no knowledge to counter that.
I think you touch, though, on actually what is a really difficult issue in academia, which is how do you mobilize the sort of gatekeeping institutions so that bad science and shoddy thinking and, you know, poor research that lacks rigor is kept out, but at the same time you allow enough internal dissent so that you are not simply creating an intellectual monoculture. And there are lots of disciplines where, you know, economics, which is one that I have one foot in, has been accused of having an intellectual monoculture where people with more wholesale critiques of certain core content are marginalized and excluded, and yet the people who might be doing the marginalization would say, well, we're just maintaining standards. And that is an inherently difficult situation to be in, and I don't think there is actually an easy formulaic answer, but I think it has something to do with meeting as a discipline so that, you know, if you can say, convince me on the basis of reason and evidence why this contrarian perspective deserves to be held, you heard, and it won't work perfectly. But what, as I said before, I think what's happened is that people have rushed off to their respective, you know, echo chambers and corners and have no longer met within a department, within a discipline, to have these actually very difficult conversations. As you know, whenever I reject an article that is sent to me as a peer reviewer, you know, am I rejecting it on the grounds that, you know, ideologically I don't like it, or I thought it had a lousy research design? And of course, in my head, it's because it had a lousy research design, but I'm sure someone else would say I'm perpetrating whiteness or something.
It goes back to what you were saying before about the duty to turn up and engage, right? Because, and to listen to ideas that you might initially think are crazy. Because from time to time, crazy ideas turn out to be true, or at least better ideas than the ones we had before.
And it's always been difficult.
It's almost always the case.
I mean, who was it? Was it Kuhn who was credited with the
paradigm
phrase
shift.
That, you know, lousy ideas you know, no, what is it? Science advances one funeral at a time.
Right.
You know, academics are notorious for protecting their own favoured ideas. And so I guess the other thing we need is pluralism, a commitment to not just hiring clones of ourselves.
See, I agree with all that. In an ideal world, that'd be good. But I also agree with what the professor said in the previous talk about, going back to Aldous Huxley in 1923 when he wrote the essay Pleasures. He was lamenting the fact that there were silent movies and people didn't have scientific debates at weddings anymore. He hadn't heard of Netflix or scrolling through Instagram, which is frankly what our staff and students are doing. So, this is aspirational. I'd love our universities to be this place, but then they're like going through their phones. That's the brutal reality of the...
Oh, I see. All right. We're being told we're over time. So thank you all very much for a vibrant discussion, and we'll see you at the next session.
Yes.